an educational series on cybersecurity, compliance, and IT governance. Produced with the support of Freedom Technologies, Phoenix's leading managed service provider.
So we gave introductions earlier, but it looks like Scott Edwards has joined us now with Abel Sanchez. They're first on deck to tell us all about banking. So Scott's got an impressive background, as I mentioned, and a lot of expertise, both on the regulatory side and in the compliance and audit side, now that he's switched gears there. But he's involved in a lot of different areas and aspects of banking security. Hey guys, thanks for joining us. And I think we got a lot of interested participants, but I'll let you take it from there.
Okay, thank you, John. Can everybody hear me? You know, my career dates back to pre-internet. So when I first started doing IT audits, the computer was in a room that was secured, and there was only one telephone line out of that room that went into the bank itself. So there was, the only thing you had to worry about was protecting that one room and what the telecommunication line that went from that room to the bank. And then we did this crazy thing. We decided that we were going to introduce the internet, and it has absolutely, totally changed the risk profile of financial institutions. There are so many products and services that banks want to offer to their customers that have a internet component. And of course, the whole premise here is that they have the motherload of non-public personal information that hackers want to get to be able to steal identities and of course convert those identities into dollars. And the financial institutions don't want to be the entity that is responsible for those breaches. And of course, you guys are aware of all of the major financial breaches. Obviously, the most significant one in the last few years is Equifax. And the Equifax breach, there was some discussion during the investigation of that breach as to whether financial institutions had some responsibility for failing to manage Equifax and how Equifax controlled the data and allowed that breach to take place. And of course, this whole industry is very heavily regulated by the federal government. So, and therefore they have certain criteria that they have expectations about. And then of course you have a financial institution that has shareholders, and those shareholders don't want to lose money. And you can potentially have lawsuits and litigation, which could cause losses and create a financial impairment to the bank and create a question of whether it can succeed. So all of this is just to set the stage for what financial institutions have to do. And internally, most community banks, and we only work with community banks, we don't deal with any of the big guys like Bank of America or Chase or Citibank or Wells Fargo. And I'm sure they have similar problems, but I'm guessing they have massive staffs that can handle the cybersecurity. And most of the community banks we deal with, they have a very limited staff. And we say this all the time when we're in the financial institutions working with them, that the hackers spend 24 hours a day, 7 days a week trying to figure out how to get in, and the bank staff spends 15, 20 minutes at a meeting once a month talking about cybersecurity, and so they're already behind the curve in terms of what they can get done, and they outsource a significant amount of the expertise that's needed to create this environment that is hopefully secure. And we talk about it all the time, and I'm sure, you know, I'm preaching to the choir here, but the real way to keep from getting hacked is don't have a significant internet presence, because that's what exposes you. And most of our banks, when we do our penetration testing and vulnerability scanning, and Abel is the technical guy, I'm more of the auditor, controls person, and I understand the banking industry, but the most of them are almost invisible as far as the outside world is concerned. And to us, that is the critical part of not getting hacked, is to minimize your presence so that you don't become a target. And that's what they try to do internally, is to try to keep as the outward facing IP addresses to a minimum, so that you don't see a lot. Now, with most of our financial institutions, they don't have the data on site. Most community banks outsource their core processing to a third party. So that means that your account information is not resident on their servers in that financial institution, wherever that their server farm resides, whether it's internally or whether it's on in a data co-location site. But most of that is the actual data, the checking account information, the loan account information. That information is not resident on the bank's servers. That resides on usually an outsourced third-party provider. And that's really, to me, that's the Fort Knox of non-public personal information, because those entities probably handle 1,000, 1,500 financial institutions in this country and other countries. And so if you can hack them, then it's like hitting Fort Knox, because that's where all the Social Security numbers are and the individual identities are, so that you can obviously convert those identities to either fraud or sell them. But so that creates an environment where the bank has to make sure that it is examining the activities and controls that these outside parties, what their controls are, so that they make sure that they protect that information, because you can outsource the job, but you can't outsource the responsibility. So the financial institution is still responsible for making sure that that information is protected. And so there is a whole process of vendor management that gets created, that they have to go in and look at their activities. And for some reason, I guess I know the reason, but the transparency is pretty bad. When you begin to ask them questions about penetration testing and vulnerability scans, and they won't share that information. Now, unfortunately, I tend to reach a negative conclusion when somebody won't tell me, because most people want to talk all the time about how wonderful they are. So if the results of those reviews was stellar, why wouldn't they share that information? Now, their argument is it's proprietary and it discloses confidential information about their infrastructure and their topography, and they don't want that getting out of their organization. But that creates problems for the user to determine, are the controls effective in that environment, because the bank has placed a significant amount of reliance on that entity to protect that information. So it's not perfect at this point, but we talked, I put on one of the slides, the regulatory environment, and the regulators have just begun to start pushing this third-party review. They're pushing contract negotiation. They've got an outline of certain contract terms that need to be in these contracts. But the issue that comes up frequently is, as I mentioned, these are community banks. These are billion-dollar banks and smaller. So they're, in many cases, these firms that they're doing business with are much larger than they are. And so trying to solicit modifications to their contract becomes difficult because, as I said, they have thousands of financial institutions that they're servicing. So when you say, well, we want you to add this particular provision that you'll be responsible for this activity if something should happen, they pretty much tell you, you know what, if you don't like it, you can go pound sand. I mean, we don't need your business. And so it becomes very difficult for financial institutions to elicit any kind of modifications to the contracts. We are starting to see the regulators get involved because each of these large service bureaus, they're also examined by the federal regulators. So the federal regulators are starting to push these vendors to get these contract terms in these contracts. So we're starting to see some ability to make them responsible. But, and you guys may see this in your world too, but many of these contracts limit their liability to the amount of fees that you have paid them. So, I mean, it's pretty easy to see that if you had a major breach and you had customers sue you for negligence, those fees wouldn't come anywhere near the damages that you would sustain. So it doesn't necessarily protect it. Well, it protects them, and that's not unusual for a contract to protect the author. I mean, that's the way they design it, is the contract's intended to protect the author, and it's the other party to the contract. They have to have some leverage to be able to negotiate those terms. And right now, the only regulation or the only leverage that we're seeing is the regulators intervening and demanding that these entities modify their contracts. But there's a whole plethora of vendors who are not examined by the federal regulators, and therefore they are not subject to that kind of pressure. And they pretty much say, you know, that's too bad. And we had an email provider that the bank wanted them to provide their penetration test and their vulnerability scans, and they just said no. And the bank CEO pretty much said, there's no way I'm going to allow email and email attachments out on somebody else's servers that I can't evaluate their penetration tests and their vulnerability scans. We need to drop that vendor immediately and get a new vendor. And so those are the risks that financial institutions go through in terms of trying to manage this cybersecurity, and most of it's because it's not it has multiple tentacles in terms of how their systems work, because they have so many different vendors who have access and who provide services and who have data, and all of that poses risk. And to a great extent, most of the breaches that have taken place, they haven't breached the actual bank. They've breached vendors of financial institutions. But the data resided in those vendors' systems, and therefore it breached the bank's information. And much of what financial institutions wrestle with is this concept of, how do we protect this data when it's not in our system, and we can't get transparency from our vendors to be able to be absolutely certain that they have controls. And you still have to run your operation. You still have to have take care of your customer. You still have to give them the flexibility to be able to access these services that all the other financial institutions provide. And of course, much of that requires internet access and the data flow between the customer and the bank and the bank's service providers, and then the core processing system. And during that, you have to be able to protect that data. And so in our minds, and when we do our IT audits for financial institutions, what we really want to make sure that we cover is, do they have an adequate system? And I say this all the time to bankers, is we want to get you out of gross negligence and just into negligence. Because if you're grossly negligent, you're going to be writing checks. If you're just negligent, you just made an error, and the courts are not typically going to award financial damages or assess penalties if you're just negligent. So what we have to try to do is create a process that will meet a prudency level to where if you are sued, and this whole identity theft thing is a little bit like trying to figure out where you got COVID. It's the same thing with identity theft. And I think about the Equifax breach, and I think, how are you ever going to prove that a particular identity theft event is traced back to someone accessing and hacking Equifax? You just can't create the cause and effect. So what happens is you get class action suits that force the person or entity being sued into settling, because you really can't prove it. It's just like with COVID. You say, well, we did some tracing and they got the coronavirus because they went to a party at somebody's house. I mean, I don't think you can actually be absolutely sure of that when you have people with different contacts and they're going to different places. So I think the same thing is true of identity theft, but and that's why we try to encourage our financial institutions that we work with is do a reasonable job of vetting this process, but understand that it's going to have limitations, and you're going to get to the end of it, and you're still going to have risks that you cannot possibly eliminate, because the only way to eliminate it is just disconnect that internet connection to your server, and then the problem's gone because nobody can get in because it's not connected any longer. But short of that, any system that you have connected, I was just talking to one of the major core processors for financial institutions around the country, and they said, well, we don't do penetration tests for our core processing because there is no internet connection. I said, well, how does the data get posted? There has to be a connection somewhere. Because all of these banks send their data over the internet. How does it get into the system and get posted if there's not? Well, it comes through our servers that surround our core processor. I said, so there is access. So that's what I need to see. And it's almost, and maybe it's because I'm not technical and I don't know how to ask the right questions, and maybe Abel or would know better how to speak to these people and get the right information. But I don't know whether it is a intended process of, if I can just keep throwing paper at them, eventually they're going to succumb to the exercise and stop asking the questions. And I'm almost at that point with this particular review, but that is that is one of the major things facing, and I would guess that it faces anyone who houses sensitive information and has other people that are involved. I mean, if it's a closed system and you're not having other third parties that are involved in any kind of access or storage of data, then you probably don't have those issues. But with most community banks that we deal with, they have significant exposure. A good example is most of the banks their mortgage processing is all, they process your mortgage in-house, but they sell it, and it has to meet secondary market requirements in order to be saleable. So there's a whole internet exchange of information, of applications, tax returns, credit reports. All of that is passing back and forth between the financial institution and the mortgage company to get the loan approved. And that's one of the concerns we have, is how is that data protected? How is it protected in transit? How is it protected at rest? Are the backups being encrypted? And all of these, I guess I'm of the opinion, and it may not be shared by any of you, but if I can figure out a way to encrypt it and I can control the decryption keys, then I don't really care if anybody has access to it, because you can't get into it anyway. And I've long believed that it's kind of like when you're in a residential area and you're a burglar and you look and you see a house that has an alarm and the lights are on the outside and there's a dog in the front yard, and you look to the next house and the lights are out, the door's partially open. I'm going to go rob the one that's partially open. I'm not going to try to mess with the dog and the lights and the alarm. And I think that's what encryption and those kinds of controls creates is I think with enough time, you probably can crack the encryption, but I believe that most people that are trying to gain access to that data, they're not going to go to that extreme when there's other low-hanging fruit that they could potentially extract. Now, we've also got a whole area of social engineering. I mean, and I think many of the hackers have figured that out, that why do I need to break into their system? I just get one of the humans to give me the information I need. They're the weakest link. And we find that all the time. And one of the processes that we go through in our cybersecurity framework is testing the human element to make sure that the human element doesn't become the person that victimizes the financial institution. And it is, you teach your employees in a bank to be customer friendly, to be attentive, to be helpful. And then you tell them, but we don't want you to be that way if there's some bad actor out there trying to convince us. And we have a whole process where we develop fake IDs, and we do phishing tests, and we do emails and fax attacks and things like that to try to test the human element. And we try to do it frequently, so hopefully they're constantly on their guard relating to giving out information that might compromise or jeopardize the system. And I'm kind of excited about some of this artificial intelligence that we're starting to get introduced into the networks. And we have a couple of our clients that have gone with Red Cloak and Carbon Black, and the purpose of those is to sort of act as a sentry inside the server. But unfortunately, it's only as good as whoever establishes the parameters. I mean, we have one client that's taken a year and a half just to set up the program. And it's because you set it up and then you test it for a while and see what breaks and what works and what doesn't work anymore. But now he's pretty comfortable that he feels like it's significantly reduced the potential of the human element introducing some malware or something bad into the system, because it stops those things and quarantines them and doesn't allow it to go forward. So those are the internal things that the banks have to deal with. And we talked a little bit about regulation. There's a few regulations that deal with e-commerce. One is the Privacy Regulation P, and basically that requires banks to provide a notice to their customers as to how they're going to share their information. And one of the exemptions in that regulation is any information that they share for the purpose of handling a transaction that the customers requested. Well, that is many times most of the sharing that community banks do is with a third party for the purpose of handling a transaction requested by the customer. And that's the very thing that we're talking about trying to control. Is it's just like MasterCard, Visa. Whenever they create a debit card and you use that debit card, that information passes over the internet and goes through. In most community banks, it goes through an exchange process through a third-party service provider who collects all that information and then reaches out and collects the money from the different financial institutions that are part of that system. But that entire system now possesses all of that person's information. And that, again, that's an area where the banks are concerned about. A breach could create a requirement, and one of the other regulatory requirements is if the bank determines that any customer's information has been breached, they're required to not only notify their regulator immediately, but they're required to notify the customer themselves that a breach has taken place and their information may be compromised. And no banker ever wants to write that letter, because you're really admitting to your customers, we were unable to protect your information, and therefore you may be a victim of identity theft. And we encourage you to log on to the FTC website and enter your information and begin to monitor your credit report. And it's not just the potential lawsuits, but it's the reputation. Can a customer trust their information with you? Now, we've had some discussion that customers may have become immune to compromises because they're becoming more common, and the actual losses and damages have not been substantial. So there's no sense of urgency, and that may help the financial institution industry, just because if a breach does occur and you do have to issue those letters, you may find that you don't get necessarily the extremely negative response that you're expecting, because the financial institutions believe that that kind of a letter is like the kiss of death, that they're going to start looking for alternatives to your financial institution for their services. We've been talking recently that we're not so sure that would happen. We're thinking that there's been so much of this happening that they may be almost tolerant of that behavior, particularly if it doesn't affect them personally. And again, as I talked about earlier, it's so difficult to develop an immediate cause and effect that, yes, this breach of this financial institution created this identity theft and these losses. It's really hard to make that connection, and certainly I think it would be that difficult to make that connection legally and in a court of law to try to find a bank guilty. But there's still the reputation risk associated with having something like that happen. There's a thing called a cybersecurity assessment tool, and this is another regulatory requirement. And this is a 600-item questionnaire that banks are now required to complete, and it goes through the various levels of their maturity in terms of cybersecurity. And it has, every bank is required to meet baseline, and then it has I think the next step is intermediate, and then there is I forget what, there's two more levels, and the regulator's expectation is that over time, and if your complexity as an institution from a cybersecurity risk perspective changes, that you will begin to meet the various levels of that, increasing your cybersecurity hopefully invulnerability so that you're not exposed. But I think Abel will share with you, and when I turn it over to him, that he and I have both determined that if they decide you're going to get hacked, you're probably going to get hacked. So the most important thing is try to keep yourself out of somebody's crosshairs. And we believe, in our small little company, and most of our banks are in rural locations in southern Colorado and northern New Mexico and eastern New Mexico. My worry is that the little college in that community, the students learning IT may be the ones trying to hack in just because they want to see if they can, not necessarily because they have any illicit thoughts. It's just, let's see if we can do this. And I don't believe that most of our banks are targets, but we do have, every one of them has reports that are prepared for the board of directors that document how many times their external firewall has been attacked, and the numbers are staggering that they keep track of that stuff. So obviously, but I don't know how much of that is actually just being shotgunned out and waiting for a response, or whether it's specifically targeted. Because when we do pen tests, obviously that's a targeted attack where you're intentionally trying to compromise that particular system. And I'm not sure if that's actually happening there. We've talked a little bit about customers, vendors. Customers are also a risk, and customers don't appreciate that these mobile devices that they carry can be infected with malware, and they have online banking on their phone. They have cash management on their phone, but they also have multiple other applications that could involve some sort of malware that could either collect data or create a man-in-the-middle setting. And of course, the bank is liable for any of these losses. There's no ignorance clause in any of these federal laws. The bank can't say, well, you're stupid, you didn't control your device, so therefore we don't have to give you your money back. The government has said, oh no, Mr. Banker, you're responsible. So if your customer does something that is stupid and downloads applications onto their mobile device that winds up compromising their user ID and password online banking, and somebody creates payees and sends out $10,000, you got to give them that money back. And so those risks also create some cybersecurity anxiety and concerns. Now we have started to see in our industry where they're pushing out controls to mobile devices, and what that means is they will not allow you to download their app to be able to get access to their system unless they can examine your mobile device and determine that they're comfortable that it is safe to be used. And I think we're going to see more of that as losses increase. But part of this is a function of competition, because if other financial institutions are not pushing to that particular control, and you decide as Mr. Community Banker, well, I'm going to have this control in place, I say, well, then I'll just move my accounts over to Wells Fargo because they don't make me do that, and I don't want to have to mess with biometrics or having to enter a PIN. So if you're going to make me control my mobile device, I'll just move my business somewhere else. So it all of these things create a cyber environment that is, I think, still has a significant amount of risk. And I'm surprised there hasn't been bigger losses. But I just keep coming back to the same thing, that I think that they're pretty much invisible as far as the hackers are concerned. So they're not a target, and I hope that continues. For the sake of these financial institutions, but does anybody have any questions for me before I turn it over to Abel to talk a little bit more about the technical aspects? I know I threw out a few buzzwords to try to make myself appear to be technical, but I'm not. I mean, he's the guy that knows the bits and bytes, but you know, I know enough to be dangerous, but I'd be happy to try to handle any question, and certainly would not be hesitant to push it to him.
Cool. Scott, this is John, and just listening to you talk, and I don't know if you're monitoring the chat, but we got kind of some things going on there. But Eileen Klein, who's still with the, well, I can never remember your exact title, Eileen, but she previously did a presentation on cybersecurity contracts, which sounds like a dry subject, but actually it's pretty fascinating and timely. So I actually think she's somebody you should know, because I think there's a lot of overlap in what you guys are doing and what your focus is. So anyway, I think there's synergy there. So a quick connection can be made possibly, but.
Scott, this is Leo. I was watching some of the chat messages and looking down some of the messages. Richard Larkins, for instance, made a comment, no such thing as a closed system in banking anymore. I can go back and tell you, well over 10 years ago, a financial institution, a very, very large financial institution I worked for, was using Facebook to be able to do marketing and HR work. So, if you ever think you can have a system that's closed today, I don't think that's ever going to be possible. I don't think it's been possible for a while, and I don't think it's ever going to be possible again in the future. So that one kind of comes out of the door. The other thing that you mentioned was talking about encryption, and there was a comment about that as well, and I think that was from Elio. Let's look back at encryption. Tell me what encryption hasn't been broken yet. RSA was broken many years ago. And every time somebody comes up with a new encryption, that's a challenge for the hackers. They'll go in there and they'll try to break it. So I don't know that, and looking at systems, encryption alone is not going to do it. You have to have layers of security and different types to be able to secure everything. So, while you talk nicely about encryption, I look at that and saying, okay, that's just another challenge for the hackers to break, and if they haven't broken already, it's going to be broken by the time we get done with the session today. So just the comments that I'm picking up from the comments from our attendees here, and I'm not real bashful about bringing that up so everybody can hear that. So I tossed that out at you, Scott. You did a great job. It says a couple of those comments. I'm looking at that. Closed system, I haven't seen a closed system, and I can't tell you when, and I started way before you did.
Yeah, and I think, and you may have misunderstood what I was saying. The core processor I was talking to said it was a closed system, and that therefore they did not do penetration tests or any kind of vulnerability scans. And I was not accepting that response for the same reasons you just mentioned, that there has to be data getting in there. And I believe it's just their way of continuing to push you off. They don't really want to answer the question. They just, because they don't really want to tell you what their controls are. They want to give you a SOC report, which may or may not address the controls you need, and hope you go away and don't ask any more questions. And that's what we're trying to say, is you got to ask more questions. You got to be more forceful. But again, as I said, it's the tail wagging the dog. You're talking about a $400 million financial institution in southern New Mexico messing with a Jack Henry and Associates that has 25,000 employees all over the world. And they're like, if you don't like it, just go away. But unfortunately, the bank still has a responsibility to do some sort of a vetting of that vendor to make sure that the controls are in place. And I agree with you. Now, the encryption issue, what I was saying was, I think it's better than not having any controls at all. And Abel and I talk about these Office 365 and these systems where the the system that the data resides on controls the decryption. I don't like that. I want a no knowledge encryption where the data resides, they can't decrypt it. They don't have the ability to decrypt it. And I think that provides a little bit better security. And I agree that someone who puts their mind to it probably can hack it. I believe that these hackers that are trying to make money from this process, they're going to go to the one that doesn't have the better encryption, because their point is, I want the data. I want to be able to convert that data to dollars, and I have a better chance of doing it with the weaker controls than the stronger controls.
I totally agree with you on that. What I find interesting, and you're on the right track. You got to keep asking the right questions. Whether you'll get the answers or not is another thing. When I worked in the security department, I was told by my management, answer all the questions that are asked of you, offer nothing more. And I don't know that hasn't changed much in today's world, and that goes back many years already. So it's kind of a crazy world when auditing and when security came out and auditors started getting more involved and they started getting smarter about the system. We found from a security standpoint that they're the savers for the security department, because we can make all the recommendations to try and tighten the system down and make it as secure as possible with the technology that's available at that time and space. However, if you don't have the backing from the management and you make suggestions to them and they say, no, we'll accept the responsibility, well, okay, let the auditors resolve that problem, and they should be able to come in, get the right questions asked and answered, and then go after them, and then they come back to security and say, oh, why the hell didn't you do this? Well, we did, and here's our documentation of making the recommendations. So go after management.
Yeah, and everything is a risk assessment. Business is a risk assessment. Somebody needs to put the risks on the table and you make a decision. We're going to move on. And as I said, all I want to try to do is get them out of gross negligence and into negligence, because the gross negligence, you start writing checks. Negligence, you can probably get by with a hand slap and move on. But if you're found to be grossly negligent, you're probably going to be writing checks. And that's our objective with our process, is to try to keep these financial institutions in the negligence category, not the gross negligence category.
Okay, sounds good. I just wanted to bring that up though, because I was seeing that, and I'm not a real bashful person about throwing stuff out and letting everybody else talk about it.
Happy to hear it.
Hey, it's Jim Moore. I worked all over the globe in banking in commercial and international. And there was a state out here in the West, this was a few years ago, that put an RFP out on the street for an umbrella banking services for the state and all of its sub-entities. And the RFP, one of the requirements in this 180-page RFP stated that the successful bidder for these banking services, this is a very lucrative contract, would agree to two key phrases that were just buried in this 180 pages. One of the phrases was unlimited indemnification, and the second phrase was assumptive neglect. That means that no matter what happens, the provider to the bank, credit card services, treasury management services, all of the systems, if anything went wrong, that it was assumed that they were negligent in their responsibilities to protect that customer. So we naturally backed away from bidding on that RFP, but there were a couple of very large institutions that agreed to it and won the contract. So I'm glad to see that the federal regulators are starting to step in and put some parameters and boxes around, fair rules in some of this stuff, because you want to talk about wild lawsuits, assumptive neglect.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Oh yeah. And I've told, I don't believe that these provisions in these contracts that limit their liability to fees paid, I don't believe they would survive a gross negligence setting. I think if the courts believe that that vendor was grossly negligent, I think they would strike those provisions and they would not hold. I think the courts would deem them nullified. And that's what I tell the banks. I said, yeah, it's in there, but if they're grossly negligent and you wind up getting breached and your customers sue you, I don't think that those clauses that try to minimize their risk would fly. But I mean, I haven't seen it tested in court, so I don't know for sure. You're up, Abel.
All right, can you hear me? Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
All right, okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Abel Sanchez. I consult with Scott Edwards. I've been doing this for 13 years. So I'm a consultant, but I do have a day job working for a DoD contractor here in town. So I've been around cybersecurity for a long, long time. I do IT, been doing IT for about 25 years now. A lot of this, what you the folks have been talking about, are very familiar to what I've been doing in the past. A quick rundown of what we do when we go into the banks. As Scott mentioned, these are community banks, are small, and it says it's a 2-day affair. We go in and we try to capture the essence of their security in 2 days, and it's a challenge. It's grown immensely over the decade with the advent of the cloud and outsourcing to third parties, and obviously the internet and all the mobile apps, etc. So we try to do the best we can in the time that we're there. So what we're doing is we're assessing their cybersecurity against the GLBA, the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act. And as Scott mentioned, there's a cybersecurity assessment tool that the banks use to basically secure their infrastructure. What we initially do is look at their policies and procedures. What we want to do is we want to take a look at if their practices are actually in sync with their policies. Bear in mind that banks can, they stay in line or in sync with GLBA, but they certainly have the right to accept certain risks if they deem them worthy, right? So I myself can't tell them they can't do something. If their management decides that they're okay doing that, then they accept the risk, and we just move forward. It's challenging because every bank has its own way of doing risk assessments, and so in the 2 days we're there, we're really pressed for time, and we're trying to get the best picture we can of their cybersecurity. So we test against their policies. We do some sampling, scans, vulnerability assessments. We also look at we're using the CIA triad, right? Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So everything's measured against those 3 terms. In our test, we're really comparing it to their policies. Are they actually adhering to what they say they're doing, right? And if they're not, obviously then it becomes a finding or an observation. If they're the other piece of that is kind of a cybersecurity best practices. There's some things that typically we like to see. Multi-factor authentication is good. Encryption is good. They're using the long keys, strong keys. So we try to steer them in that direction. But it's a challenge, and Scott will tell you, will admit to this as well, in that we really are looking to see if bank management is engaged in cybersecurity, because there's times where there is a cybersecurity or IT expert within the bank, and the bank manager will defer cybersecurity or IT operations to that individual or individuals, and they're basically, I'm not saying they wash their hands of it, but they're not as engaged. And so one of Scott's challenges is to make sure that management is engaged in cybersecurity, that they're not just deferring it and hoping that the person is taking that responsibility is doing the right thing. And in that regard, in the community banks, it's a big challenge because they're typically smaller towns. Finding IT talent can be a challenge. Sometimes they may outsource IT to a company either in town, or we've seen them outsource to companies in different towns and outside of their area. And now we're having to assess whether management actually knows what's going on with respect to IT, cybersecurity, and if they're aware, if they're involved enough with management to be able to certainly intervene when they have to, or at least realize that there's some issues there. So one of our jobs is to try to assess that entire framework in the 2 days that we're there. Is leadership engaged, right? And it's no two banks are alike. They're all different, and they all have to take, as far as the level of involvement. They can be all over the place, but we find that the banks that whose management is really involved, they are the ones that are far better. They tend to anticipate the issues and certainly and get involved early on, and certainly take to heart what Scott basically provides them by way of advice, because they certainly they make the effort to understand what the issues are.
Well, I think Abel brings up a great point. I didn't even think about that, but one of the things facing these institutions, and I think many of the businesses out there, is they don't understand the technical side of this. So when you have a single point of information, being that IT person, management really can't evaluate whether are they telling me what I should be doing and what I'm supposed to be doing? I don't understand. I mean, they could tell me that, oh no, you need to open this up and leave it open. I mean, we've gone into banks that still have DHCP enabled, and we're like, how do you even allow this? And it's because they're as good as the IT professional that is counseling them within their organization. So it is, I think it is so important that every business who has cybersecurity risk involve more than just their internal people in the discussion, unless the owners or the management of the organization has their own IT background and comfort. It is a very complex business, and making wrong decisions can have catastrophic impacts. And I don't believe you should ever leave yourself at the mercy of a single opinion. And part of what we do when we go in there is we try to provide them with another opinion. But I think it's so important that every organization, whether it be a financial institution or any other, that when they're going to have that kinds of sensitive data exposed, I think they need at least two opinions. I think they need to go out and get an independent third party who can be independent and has the knowledge and expertise to be able to assess are the recommendations that are being posed by their internal people the right course of action. Because we frequently will say, no, we don't think that's the way you should go. And I think that's important, but not every business has an IT audit that can have access to that kind of expertise.
So along those lines as well, not only is it important that management get involved with IT, it's also important that IT have the skill set that the bank needs. And that's another challenge for the banks, in that there's a distinction between just IT management, applying patches, creating account provisioning space, et cetera. And then on top of that, then you you have the requirement of cybersecurity. You know, how do you actually properly configure a firewall? How do you run a vulnerability assessment, pen test? You know, what is a separation of duties? What does that mean? Due care, due diligence, someone just mentioned in the chat. You know, those things actually mean something in cybersecurity. In standard IT operations, there's folks that don't even know what that means. So now there's an added challenge for the banks to bring in expertise with cybersecurity chops to be able to bring that to bear on the operations. And so we also have to kind of look at the skill set that's within the bank and try to advise them as to, I think you should be consulting with maybe another vendor, or maybe have more training for the individuals that are supporting your bank infrastructure. So it's really a challenge for the banks. I'm always surprised or in the fact that the banks have this love-hate relationship with the internet, right? So they have assets that they want to protect. So naturally, they want to be as far away from any public access as they can get, right? They don't want to be in the internet if they can help it, right? But on the other side, they have customers who want them to be out there, to have mobile devices, to make data available as easily as possible. So they have no choice but to be there. So now they're straddling these two worlds where they're trying to protect everything they can, and at the same time they're opening up wherever they can. And that's a very, very interesting challenge. And these banks have to do it 24/7. This is no just Monday to Friday. They have to do it every day. And I find it interesting that as I work with the DoD contract side, that they have secure facilities, SCIFs, where they have fence upon fence upon fence of protection. They have guards, they have monitoring systems, they have mag locks on the doors, they have a secure network, they have crypto, you name it, and they have policies and procedures, and those are very, very secure facilities. And I find that the banking world is in need of protection, and it's a much harder job in the banking world than it is in the DoD contracting side, because they have a lot more resources and certainly can be off the grid to an extent, whereas the banks can't. And since when I started doing this 13 years ago, I learned that lesson. It's like, well, these folks have to, they're flying constantly, and they're changing engines, in flight. They have no choice but to keep flying. So anyways, it really made me a far better IT person once I started working in IT auditing. Now, as far as tools, obviously we do assessments. We use scanners. We do some pen testing. We certainly look at administrative controls, hiring practices. Are they vetting their people? Are they training? We look at logical controls, firewalls, natting, ACLs, IDS, IPS. We look at physical controls. Do they have monitoring? Do they have any alarms? And then in the servers, they have smoke detectors, alarms as well. Also, the other thing that we also look at is availability, and this is something that people don't really think about, but banks can't really afford not to be online. So their servers, you can't have a power cord, going across the floor where somebody could trip over that or pull the power cord and the server goes down. It's not an option for the bank. So we look at availability. What could impact their availability for the firewall, for their systems, for their servers. BCP, business continuity protections, right? Plans, disaster recovery plans. That's another one that we're looking at as well. So,
sorry to interrupt, but we're probably coming up on our time limit for the presentation. So if you want to wrap it up, we'll kind of answer questions.
Yeah. So briefly, it's just we cover a lot of ground as quickly as possible, and it's a great challenge, but it's fun, and I've learned a lot from doing it. Scott?
I got a question for you. you guys have been talking about all these things, and you have not mentioned PCI DSS at any time. These community banks have to have interfaces to the payment card industry. What's your exposure to PCI DSS?
Well, their exposure is the vendor that they hire to process their credit cards. Most community banks don't process their own credit cards. They go through an outside third party. And that again gets back into the vendor management. How are you evaluating the controls in place at that vendor?
But that's part of 3.0 plus of PCI is you have to evaluate those vendors as part of that, and you're subject to that audit.
Yeah, but unfortunately, they won't give you that audit. They'll give you the summary page, which I don't know what tests they conducted to come to those conclusions. So I'm not satisfied with the results, but that's all they're going to give you.
Then they fail the audit in my book.
Well, you know, I think with these audits, it's a function of how much they paid. If they paid enough, they're going to pass the audit. It's just like a SOC 2 that has no exceptions. I don't believe anybody's that good. So when you send me a SOC 2 on a company that has 25,000 employees and it has 0 findings, I don't believe it. Yep. I believe you just bought an audit. That's what I believe.
Yeah, I've done ATO assessments of exactly the type of facility that Abel talks about, and we have several exceptions always.
I think every auditor needs to see at least 1 or 2 exceptions, just otherwise they won't go away.
Oh, we'll go away. Just tell us to go away.
Pay them enough money.
Yep.
All right. So we've got just about an hour left. It's not a hard stop, but we like to keep the meeting ending at 9. If people want to stick out and talk or whatever, that's fine. So we've got Ford Winslow up next. He's ready to go. Just a quick note, I don't know if everybody's monitoring the chat group. So kudos to Elio. He just set up a Keybase account for really anybody that wants to join. So that's open. So it's secure messaging. You know, everybody's got their platform of choice. Is it Slack? Is it, you know, whatever. But this is generally considered secure. And I'll just say if Elio considers it secure, it's probably secure. So if anybody wants to jump on that.
As with every proprietary platform, it is for now. Zoom bought them up to shore up their security, so I wouldn't count on it staying as awesome as it was forever. But the initial team did some awesome stuff in key management, hence the name. And basically, my quick description, it's like if you combined all the good stuff from Slack and Signal and Dropbox and all the things without all the annoying crap they do, and you put it into one platform. And the crypto right now is pretty solid. So I figure we got 6 to 24 months before Zoom ruins it, but we should have some fun in the meantime. So
I think it's ruined already. It's still trying to load on my Mac.
You're the second person out of like dozens who's had problems. So try again, Rich. Like it'll work. Keep going. There is a web interface for those that have to use it through the web, but you don't actually even need a password. The way it manages keys, you could just set it up between devices and link them. So
I've got it on my Mac. Seems to be can work in most situations, perhaps.